So good morning. Thank you for helping us begin the Humanities Montana Festival of the Book. This is the 12th year. It's just an amazing festival. It's a carnival. It's fun to be among book lovers. Go books, right? We love books. I'm Ken Egan, Executive Director of Humanities Montana, and it's my honor to introduce today's panel. Our first writer, going in alphabetical order, is Don Aadland. Did I say that correctly? Dan Aadland. Let's start over. Dan Aadland, that's it, Dan, is a rancher and writer and retired teacher who breeds horses in Absorki. His books include In Trace of TR, A Montana Hunter's Journey, The Best of All Seasons, 50 Years as a Montana Hunter, and Sketches from the Ranch, a Montana memoir, terrific book. Next is William Adler. He's a freelance writer who has contributed to numerous publications, including Esquire, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones, Texas Monthly, and the Texas Observer. He's the author of Land of Opportunity, about the rise and fall of a crack cocaine empire, and Molly's Job, following the flight of one woman's factory job from the U.S. to Mexico. Bill lives with his wife and son in Denver, and his latest book, which is accumulating outstanding reviews, and I'll add one myself, is a biography of Joe Hill, the man who never died. That's a pretty good title, too. Mary Capello is a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow in Nonfiction. She is the author of 3 previous books of literary nonfiction, including Awkward, a Los Angeles Times bestseller, Called Back, a critical memoir, and Cancer, that won a Forward Book of the Year award and an Independent Publisher Book Award, and the memoir Night Bloom. Mary is a recipient of the Bechtel Prize for Educating the Imagination. That's pretty cool. From Teachers and Writers Collaborative, and the Dorothea Lange Paul Taylor Prize from Duke University Center for Documentary Studies. She's also a former Fulbright lecturer at the Gorky Literary Institute in Moscow, and currently a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Rhode Island. Last but not least, certainly, Donald Hardy served for 18 years as Senator Alan K. Simpson's press secretary and chief of staff. He then went on to serve as director of government affairs at the Smithsonian Institution. He is the author of Shooting from the Lip. Shooting from the Lip. I'll try that. The Life of Senator Alan Simpson, and he lives in Red Lodge. So let's welcome our 4 writers. So the first question I'm going to pose to them, playing off the title of the session, what attracted you to tell someone else's story? And just to kind of follow on, what are the emotional and ethical challenges of poring over another person's life?
Thank you. I suppose 2 things. First of all, with the Theodore Roosevelt, obviously a fascination with the person. It probably started in boyhood when my father dragged us on one of the many family vacations, and I sat literally on the restaurant, and was interested in the fact that this particular man of the 4 presidents was different in several ways. A couple of them superficially wore glasses and had a mustache. He was younger. And for some reason, my elementary school education had probably taught me less about him than the other 3. So certainly there was lifetime fascination, which only grew as time went on. The other thing is more a commercial or an interest in I guess you would say, in my development as a writer. A few years ago, my agent sold a hunting proposal, a proposal for a hunting book called The Best of All Seasons, to the University of Nebraska Press, which surprised me because it's a wonderful press with a myriad of titles, but not a lot of hunting books. And I went on to learn that the only other book about hunting in their entire inventory was by Theodore Roosevelt, Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail. So I had this year of glory in which I could walk around and say, yeah, the University of Nebraska Press is going to publish this. And it's the only other hunting book in their whole inventory is by this guy named Roosevelt. And so eventually, of course, I had to be prompted to sort of do something about that. There's much trepidation involved in tackling a character so well known as Roosevelt, as Theodore Roosevelt. When I was a graduate student in the early 70s, I had a wonderful and pretty well-known committee chairman named B. Walker, who said at one time that in presidential elections, and he was the sort who kept track of this sort of thing, the president most quoted by candidates of both parties was Thomas Jefferson. And I think in the early 70s that's probably true. I think hands down now it would be Theodore Roosevelt. So one does not tackle a project that involves him in any way lightly. My particular angle was to do some of the things, some of the same things, in some of the same places, and in some of the same ways, usually horseback, that Roosevelt did. And I won't claim that was an absolutely necessary way to get to know him, but I do think it revealed some things about his character, and perhaps mine, that I might not have found with another approach. As far as ethical challenges, of course, academically, your facts have to be straight when you deal with some. You have not only all sorts of associations. I belong to two, the Theodore Roosevelt Association. It is full of family members, such as Tweed Roosevelt. It is a particular, has particular areas of interest, and here centered in Missoula, Montana, the Boone and Crockett Club, which is equally devoted to his legacy, but in a somewhat different way. Believe me, if you make a mistake, you'll hear about it factually. But subjectively, getting to know Roosevelt as a friend, which I think I did, far-fetched as it may sound, was certainly less open to criticism and more my own ballpark. Emotionally, yes, I found an actual emotional attachment. My wife did as well. By the time she knew less about him, said she knew him well, felt she knew him well, and had grown to really like him. So, I don't know how complete that is, but I'll turn it over and I'll take them.
Hi, I did the biography of Joe Hill for basically one reason: Theodore Roosevelt was taken. But I got onto it because I'd been reading Bob Dylan's memoir, Chronicles, back 5 or 6 years ago. And he devotes about 3 pages to Joe Hill in his book and what an influence Joe Hill was on American protest music, and what an influence he had been on Woody Guthrie and in turn Pete Seeger and on Dylan himself. And it just it suggested to me that I didn't know as much as I thought I did about the history of folk music in this country. I wanted to learn more, and I've written some labor history, more contemporary labor history, but it just seemed like a great match for my particular set of interests in terms of writing and journalism. When I got onto that story, it was to me foremost a murder mystery. For those of you who don't know, Joe Hill was tried for murder in Salt Lake City in 1914 for the murder of a former police officer turned grocery store owner, and his son as well perished when 2 masked men rushed into a grocery store, pointed their revolvers at this grocer, shouted, "We've got you now," and proceeded to kill him. and then fled. There was no attempted robbery or anything like that. But when Hill was arrested a couple of days later, he had the misfortune of having a gunshot wound in his chest the same night as those murders were committed. And the allegation was by the state that the grocer's son, who also died in this crime, as I said, had gotten off a gunshot in the moment before he was killed himself, and that shot had wounded Joe Hill. So this was, to me, a great unresolved murder mystery. Although he was convicted and subsequently executed by fire squad in 1915, there were many questions at the time surrounding his guilt. And those questions were continually raised by generations of labor activists and other folks as well. Hill had been a member and the chief songwriter for the industrial workers in the world, the Wobblies. And that was a dangerous thing to be in Salt Lake City, Utah at that time, to be a radical and to be a prominent one. So that all interested me. It also opened up this great window of American history, this period between the turn of the 20th century and World War I, when labor and capital were at the barricades like never before or never since. And I wanted to explore that, and I thought telling that story through the prism of Joe Hill's murder case would be a good way to do it. And so that's really what prompted my getting into it. So I'm going to turn it over to Marilyn. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mary Capello, and I'm a bit of the odd woman out on this panel, insofar as my book perhaps is the only one that doesn't treat a political figure, but a medical man. And the book that I've been asked to speak to is called Swallow, subtitled Foreign Bodies, Their Ingestion, Inspiration, and the Curious Doctor Who Extracted Them. It is quite a mouthful. I came to this subject purely by accident, and I love that this is somehow the ways in which material comes to a writer. I was visiting the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's one of the few extant medical museums in the country, a collection of anatomical specimens that were gathered together by a doctor in the mid-19th century named Thomas Dent Mutter, ostensibly as a teaching tool. I was visiting the museum because a friend of mine was writing a book about peristalsis. I keep strange company. She was working on a project of the things that go through us and how we are moved through systems as well. We went there ostensibly to take a look at the gigantic bowel that is on display. We turned a corner together, and actually the she who happened upon a collection of drawers. She said, "Take a look at this." Hundreds of drawers filled with thousands of objects. Unlike anything else in the collection, these were not parts of bodies, and yet they had an affiliation with bodies. There was a corporeality about these things, but they were objects that had in every case been swallowed or inhaled and then retrieved by a pioneering laryngologist named Chevalier Jackson, framed, kept, saved, documented, endlessly collected into this cabinet. Well, wouldn't you want to write a book about this? Initially, I am trained as a poet, and so initially I was moved by the collection as such. Didn't really know much about Jackson, and I just was really moved by the poetry of this collection. I wondered what kind of cosmology these things could inhabit. What universe do they inhere inside of it? So I thought I'd write an essay. Then I discovered that Chevalier Jackson had written a best-selling autobiography in 1938. Being a literary sort, I read his autobiography. It documented a practically unreadable in this sense, profoundly traumatic account of a barely survivable childhood. He told the story of a man who grows up to be the father of endoscopy, an instrument designer, a humanitarian, a woodworker, a carpenter, a painter, and indeed, of course, a runner. It was then that I realized that a book waited to be written about him, about the collection, but also about his patients. I started to encounter and experience the collection as a haunted house whose stories, ghosts of stories, needed to be reconstructed. And so my book is an attempt to sort of collage these three things together. Who was this man? What are these things? How does someone swallow that? Very briefly, I'll try to you also asked us sort of emotional and ethical challenges, very as quickly as I might. One of the major emotional challenges for me in writing this book had to do with what I encountered when I started to read the case histories. And for me, the ethical imperative of the work I was doing had to do with not simply being titillated by things in the Mucha Museum. What would it mean to strike an ethical relationship to these materials? For me, this required not just opening the drawers, having a scintillating experience going home, but going into the National Library of Medicine and uncovering the stories that are attached to these objects. In one case, there was a case of a boy who was fed 30 plus items by a deranged babysitter. 9-month-old baby whose life Jackson saved. And this case study was distinct because it had photographs attached to it of the boy. As he got older, his family sent photographs of him to Chevalier Jackson to show their thanks to him. Here he is thriving. He saved his life. 9 months old, he had a collection of safety pins stuck in his esophagus, among other things. I did not want to have to think about the mind that would have concocted this act. This is not what I wanted to write about. What I felt that I needed to. I needed to try to understand the babysitter as much as I was trying to understand Chevalier Jackson and his work. And on that note, I'll pass the microphone.
Well, the question was, what attracted me to do this? Nothing, actually. My wife, Becky, and I were retired and living we've been traveling a long time, living on a sailboat in the Caribbean, having a pretty good time, when the phone rang. The Dominican Republic had connected to something. Al Simpson was on the other end of the line saying, some people have asked me if they could write a story of my life, but they don't know me as well as you do. So would you like to take a shot at it? And I said, just a second now, I need to get the cork out of this bottle of Chardonnay. and it's a beautiful day and a beautiful wife, and why would I do that? And he said, because I'll give you everything I have. Papers, collections, letters, a lifetime of newspaper clips of things he'd written and received. And most importantly, his entire diary. In his 10 years of the leadership of the U.S. Senate, he created a private diary. It was intended only for himself, but he did create it and put down the most intimate details you can imagine. Meetings in the White House, in the Oval Office, other centers of power, talking with Gorbachev before the fall of communism in Moscow, describing everything there, putting down everything possible in terms of first-person quote. This diary grew to 6,000 pages. It's well over 2 million words. And when he said that I could have exclusive access to it and everything else he owned, I said, okay, we're sailing for America. And then came the next question. Not having been even thought about doing this, I suddenly realized after agreeing to do it, I had no clue how to do it. I had never written, I'd written a lot of things for Al, and articles and newspaper items and all kinds of things that he used over the years, or changed and used. But I'd never written a book. And so I thought, well, how do I do this? So I thought, well, I'll ask my friends. And somebody sent me a book written by a Harvard professor that I got about 10 pages through and realized I couldn't understand it. It used phrases in explaining how to write a biography, such as the empirical description of aesthetic expressionism, ethnology with evocative resonance, the intersection of aesthetics and empiricism. And then there was a sentence that said, academicians tend to speak to one another in a language that's often opaque. And the next paragraph was the phrase, phenomenological paradigm. So that set me back. Then I got my hands on a book written by a Wyoming professor. First one written by a Harvard professor, now a Wyoming professor from the University of Colorado. And this was a book about another senator in Wyoming. And he was also governor of the state. And I thought this might be a good example. Well, the problem with the second book was that it was mostly fabricated. Which I don't say based on my own observation. I asked him. There was a letter written that was quoted verbatim. And I said, where's a copy of this letter? The author, who was a college professor teaching the writing of biography, said, I just made it up because it made it easier for people to understand the story. More entertaining, he said. So he said it didn't exist. There's an ethical question that made things worse. And then I nearly had a stroke when he told me that when I found out the book was being promoted as having been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. So I got a hold of him and said, how did this happen? I hadn't seen it. He said, well, I wrote a letter to them and I nominated myself. That's why he's promoting the book as a Pulitzer Prize nominated book. Well, needless to say, these things really caused me trouble. I had no idea then how to proceed. And especially when I read how he decided to write a biography. And he wrote words like these. I viewed a biography as tales trapped within a wall, blown out by the displacing of details which I would pull from the interior recesses to flesh out and bring to literary life with my own magic. My own first book hung in the background like an elegant tapestry. With the aid of my talents, I wrote in 3 months. The biography began more than a quarter century earlier. Holding the artisan work in my hands, I felt life within its pages. I performed this magic. Well, that put me back another 6 months. The question became, once I decided to do it, the question about ethics became, how does a guy write a book about somebody who's known to millions of people around the country, has had a whole life in the public eye, and everybody knows, or everybody will find out that I worked for him every minute of his time in the Senate. How could people not perceive that this would be a puff piece? So I set to work finding the lowest points in his life and determining that I would illustrate the entirety of his life, top to bottom, highs and lows. And I told him that, number one, he had no editing rights at all. He could make suggestions if he wanted, but I held the rights to the book. And I would focus on the low points and the challenges in his life to every extent that I talked about the high points and the victories. He agreed to that. He said, let hair, eyeballs, and teeth fall to the floor if that results from telling the truth. And so I did. In the first chapter, by the third page, you'll find cars blown up, buildings blown completely apart, and mailboxes shot up to the degree that he landed on federal probation. I felt good about this from an ethical point of view. And throughout the course of his life, I pulled no punches because I thought if I need to protect the book's credibility and my own, I had to say it the way it really was. But in answer to the main question, why was I initially interested in doing this? Why would I think it should be done? I knew him so well, and I've known him over a half century. I knew him so well that I didn't want people's memory of him after he's gone to be his last spat with Bill Maher. There's a lot of volatility in politics, and there's nobody that goes up and down faster than now. And I thought it would be right to cement in the history annals of American political history exactly who this guy was and what he stood for, good, bad, no matter what it was. And so I did this as a way of telling a story that I thought ought to be told, because I think, especially having drawn from the diaries, there is an awful lot of information in there that will add credibility and flesh out some of the things that we've all heard about in history, but nobody really knew what was said. And he was there, he took it down, he pointed out what other people said, all in first person quote. And so more than anything else, I think this is a document, in addition to being about Mel Simpson, about events of the day that some people are going to find of interest.
Before I ask my second question, I'm going to urge you to be formulating your own, because in a couple minutes I'm going to say, what would you like to ask of these writers? That was wonderful, very lively. So my simple second question is, what surprised you most about your subject?
A couple of categories. The peripheral reading, the background reading one must do.
We're going to use this way if we can here. It's hard to hear.
one simply learns facts that he hadn't known before, of course. Those are the simple things. I hadn't realized that Theodore Roosevelt was an ornithologist of such quality that he probably could have walked into any major university and become a professor of that subject, even putting well-known naturalists like John Muir to shame in that respect. In fact, he was a little shocked that Muir didn't know more about birds, though he loved his description of the water ouzel. But on a more personal note, one partial surprise, one greater surprise, the man's sensitivity and his spirituality. Those things tend to be masked by the bully stereotype we have of Theodore Roosevelt. He was, in fact, I think, well, much has been made lately, of course, about his coming to the West after the double tragedy of his wife and mother dying on the same day in his house. But certainly, the more one reads, and I emphasize the primary sources, back to my old graduate professors again, like Walker, go to them first, and most of my reading, the bulk of it was Roosevelt's own words. Another factual surprise, most Americans don't realize he was our most published president, over 40 books, probably read more and wrote more than any other president, including Jefferson. A book a day, even while he was in the White House, he read a book a day. Never went anywhere without something to both to read and write, and I detail a night spent in a snowy line shack with a cowboy when they were both retrieving lost horses, when he read Hamlet aloud to the cowboy, and they had a good discussion of Polonius's advice. The spirituality, because he didn't wear it on his sleeve, and of course today we scrutinize presidents. I think ever since Eisenhower, and certainly since the Kennedy-Nixon election, we've had the obligatory photos of the families heading into a church. Roosevelt was a conservative Dutch Reformed Christian who even during his White House years sneaked away, and instead of going to the National Cathedral with his wife and children, sneaked away to a little Dutch Reformed church. And again, that was in the day when that was considered a more private matter than it is. But it becomes important in a book about hunting and conservation, because I think the concept of stewardship that became the center, really the center of his particular approach to conservation and the environment, was rooted in that background. So the book spends some time on that side of Roosevelt. I'd say that was the thing that probably I was least expecting. So far we're okay.
Most everything I learned about Joe Hill was a surprise to me, because I didn't know a whole lot about him. Mainly what I knew from the eponymous folk song, Joe Hill, or I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night. It's a song that Paul Robeson sang in the 40s, and Pete Seeger sang, and Joan Baez famously sang at Woodstock, and that's about all I knew about him. It occurred to me that Joe Hill was in this pantheon of American folk heroes, and then I started thinking about folk heroism, and started thinking that maybe Americans don't take our folk heroes all that seriously, because to me he was almost a stick figure or a cartoon figure up there with John Henry and Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. That's how I saw him. But it occurred to me that this guy earned his mythology the hard way. And I wanted to examine that mythology, and particularly this question, and I guess this was the most surprising aspect of the research in this book for me, which was after Joe Hill was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, he had a choice. He could have testified about the circumstances of that gunshot wound I described a little while ago, and he chose not to. He chose to remain silent. And he did so for a number of reasons, but in the end, I think he did so because he began to so closely identify with his cause, which was the liberation of the working class back then, that I think he had a hard time distinguishing himself as an individual from this larger cause. And once that happened, he wanted and was willing to become a martyr for that cause. So I think that the question he had to ask and answer was a profound one, and it was, if a cause is important enough to live for, is it also worth dying for? And researching that particular question, I think, and the answer to it was the most surprising thing I learned, because he, in a way, was complicit in his own myth-making, in his own legend. And that's something that I had no idea about, and perhaps that is true of other people who end up as folk heroes. John Brown, for one, I think probably would fall in that same category. Bake the Blue Ox, I'm not so sure. But I guess that would be the most surprising thing. Thanks.
Well, I wanted to answer this question by way of the importance of the archive in an age. Nothing replaces archival materials, the material world, and especially when one is writing a life. So I was surprised by things like what it felt like to hold Chevalier Jackson's wallet in my hand, and to discover there in a four-leaf clover, even though I had read that Jackson, and I knew by his own account, that he was not someone who was bound by chance, did not trust really anything except for what he could make happen. And so I had then to try to reckon with his carrying a four-leaf clover in his wallet. I also was surprised by his coat. It was very small, and it probably could fit me. But he was so grand a fellow. He had made such a monumental contribution to the history of medicine and to saving so many people's lives. Such a tiny coat. It was quite a surprise. I was surprised to discover in the archives that in opposition to the way in which, again, he was thought of as a kind of eccentric loner, even though he was known for his warmth in his patient interactions, and of course his ability to calm people. He performed these non-surgical procedures without anesthesia. It's really awe-inspiring and mind-boggling. In spite of that, he was not very social, and he explains this in his autobiography. It had somewhat to do with the way in which his early childhood was made up of a history of bullying. To such an extent, as I said, it's hard to imagine how he survived his childhood. But I discovered, to my surprise, in the archives again of the National Library of Medicine, a correspondence that unfolded between him and a fellow laryngologist named Thomas R. French. These letters were rife with affection, and I therefore discovered that he certainly was not friendless, but that here in this correspondence there was a loving affection at work. I was surprised that no one had written this book yet. I felt very lucky that I was able to do it. I was surprised that in the course of my career, something happened that I would never have anticipated, which was that I got to know a sword swallower. No fortune teller had ever told me this would happen. And I not only got to know him, but I tried to tell his story in my book too, and I came to hugely respect actually the work that he does. Last but not least, on the other side of archival work is, I think, something we don't talk about much with regard to nonfiction, and that is the relationships that are enabled and the worlds that open following the presence of a book in the world. And so I was surprised by the many relationships that I forged between people who are either Jackson's patients or have worked with him or his great-grandchildren, And it surprised me that intimacy could be forged across the foreign body collection. I said that was last but not least, but when sitting here and thinking about surprise, I guess I should also mention that I was surprised in the course of my writing the book with a breast cancer diagnosis. And I had to stop the work on the book for a while in order to, of course, write a book about breast cancer. That was a great surprise. It helped me. The book, working with Jackson material, helped me to run the course of my treatment. And when I returned to the book, I had a new appreciation and understanding of the material that was before me, and certainly felt quite lucky to be able to complete that work.
Shift is motion here. Yeah.
So the question, what surprised me most? These answers came to me not quickly, but over the course of decades of knowing Al Simpson. I think his emotional range, his willingness to show his emotions in public, to be as human as you can imagine, his independence of thought. He was a Republican leader, but has as many Democrat friends as Republicans. His volatility in youth and capacity for work. His mother spent a good part of his youth trying to keep him from being like his grandfather, who had shot a banker for having bounced his check. Although to his credit, he did give the guy warning. Turns out he was chairman of the Democrat Party of Park County, Wyoming. This is Metis, Wyoming. And the check was bounced, and he came in and said to the banker, a guy named Hayes, he came from Red Lodge originally, and said, Hayes, you bounced my check. Why is that? He said, we don't like Democrats here. Maybe you'd like to take your business someplace else. He said, I've got money in the bank. The guy said, like I said, we don't like Democrats. He said, don't do that again. And 2 weeks later, he did. Simpson brought in his gun, put it on the counter, and said, well, you did it, didn't you? And he said, yeah, I did. He picked up the gun and he fired it right at his head, and the bullet went down the side of his face and nearly ripped his ear off. And he was never charged with a crime, although he was running for a public office at the time. He lost by 3 votes because apparently some people thought you shouldn't shoot bankers. But his volatility was a real factor in Simpson's early life. And I didn't realize the degree until I really started researching this. And 2 other things really surprised me. And I'm just going to read a short part of a letter. His relationship with George Bush Sr. was, I knew he had a close relationship, but if I can find this. This is a letter that I found in his private, This is a handwritten letter I found in Simpson's archives. It was tucked away in a very private place, but I left nothing unturned. And so I found this letter. It's a 2-page letter from President George H.W. Bush to Al after the Clarence Thomas hearings. And he talks about how he thinks maybe he's a little bit down, and he'd really been into it with the press. Starting from the middle of the letter, George Bush says, I'll confess there are days that I just hate this job. Not many, but some. The attacks that demean one's character sometimes get to me too. The ugly columns don't set very well when we're trying to do our hardest on some project or another, but then always the sun comes up. Yesterday at Camp David, I was feeling a little down. I picked up 2 bright red leaves, and I did something I haven't done for 60 years. I put the leaves pressed into a heavy book in my quiet little office. I felt better, strange, but I did. Don't let the bastards get you down. Your friends love you, this president depends on you, and believes in you, and is grateful to you, and nothing you can do can change that. That's a pretty potent handwritten letter for anybody to receive from a president, and that he developed that relationship was a surprise. The other surprise comes in the form of a letter. It wasn't a surprise to me, but it surprised a lot of people. This is a letter written to Pastor Fred W. Phelps of the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas, who had attacked Al publicly for support of gay rights. The letter reads, I just wanted to alert you to the fact that some busy son of a bitch is sending out mailings and emails from the Westboro Baptist Church and using your name. I'm certain that you would not want this to continue, or some less alert citizen might think that you yourself had done it. We surely know that's not the case because you are a God-fearing Christian person filled to the brim with forbearance, tolerance, and love. And this other goofy homophobe, that must be somebody totally off. Those things come as a surprise when you pick up letters like that.
Very good. So now it's your turn to ask questions, and just to remind you, so we have a biography of TR, focused on his hunting. We have a biography of Al Simpson, biography of Joe Hill, the labor agitator, great songwriter, and a biography of Chevalier Jackson, who was a pioneer in removing objects from people's throats. By the way, I have to testify, I read all of these books, and they are wonderful. So what questions do you have? Show them up. Yes?
I am interested in advice on weaving together major themes in a book. How do you, I guess I'm looking at Mary first, because you mentioned 3, I think. And so I just was wondering, how did you proceed with that? And others.
Thank you for the question. And the matter of form is never a simple one. I think that I feel as though biography in the States can afford to push its limits a bit more. I have all respect for the conventional biography, making brick-like tomes that document a life from begin to end. They are awe-inspiring. But because I'm trained as a poet, partly, I'm interested in the ways in which form need not be dictated in advance. And I very much believe that it's important to consider the ways in which the problem that a writer is working with might encourage or inform the shape of the book. What I was doing in this book, the way that I wove the 3 themes together, was to use the model, after all, of the cabinet that I was working with. And so I tried to orchestrate the book as though the reader were opening a different drawer in the cabinet. Now, by different, I don't mean that there was no organizing principle, but it had to do for me with striking juxtapositions. And again, this is where poetry comes in, because it's all about what happens when you put X next to Y. Y sheds different light on X than Z would, etc. So the shape of the book is oriented around what I call a set of contiguous drawers, but then also an attitude of moving forward and back, almost in the way that a scope would, telescopically, microscopically, forward and back. So zooming in on the life of Chevalier Jackson, pulling back from it, turning in the direction of an object. I hope that helps. I think that the way to go at it that I would advise is to think in terms of what is the shape that is required or called for by your particular problem, question, or subject.
Anybody else want to respond?
I'm not sure this is right on point, but I want to try to reconstruct a little bit about how I tried to organize, structure the book thematically. I didn't know what the themes were per se going in, and I think Mary would agree, you don't always know. I think that's one of the things you were saying there. So it was dictated in large part by the research and the way that the contours of the research changed over the years I was working on this book. And when I finally felt like I had done enough research, actually my editor said no more, I had to really sit down and think very hard about not only the structure of the book itself, but the themes, and they then kind of popped out at me, and I think this is the hard part to explain, but I think somehow, subconsciously, I knew what the themes were as I was doing the research, and I was researching in those directions, but I couldn't probably articulate it then or now very well. I can articulate the themes, but not how I reach them, other than just kind of continuing to pile fact upon fact and then figuring out how it might flow. So I don't know if that helps.
I just also want to add that there were three questions that I heard people asking always when I was in the museum examining the collection. The three questions I would overhear the public asking: who was he? What are these things? How does someone swallow that? And so this was a really simple armature that I thought could contain some very complex answers. So if that helps also.
Thank you. Other questions? All right, yes.
What was for anybody, what was the most important thing you learned about yourself?
Let me just repeat that. What was the most important thing you learned about yourself from working on somebody else's story?
This is very short. I think the most important thing I learned about myself was that I was perverse enough to do this for 6 years. And that my wife was generous enough with me to allow that I'd be up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, because that's when things were clearest to me. And if I can just add one point to the last question, I started by organizing chronologically. And I found out that that didn't work because I wanted to jump back to the ancestry, the shootings and all. Then I found out that because certain issues like immigration permeated the entirety of his life, it was very difficult on a chronological basis to keep bouncing back to that, because it would be easy to lose track of what had happened last. So after I had it laid out chronologically, I went back and created theme chapters. Immigration is one of them. The challenge then becomes keeping things in a timeline correct, because now you've got something in chapter 7 that hasn't happened yet. And you've got to be very careful when you start organizing things across the span of someone's life into themes, because the timeline is the most difficult aspect.
That's not an easy question, Russell. In a way, though, it does play back to the last question too, because I was not going to attempt a full academic biography of Theodore Roosevelt. Lots of good ones have been done. So I had to look at what interested me and what unified, what the unifying factors of the book. What was the glue that held it together? And the glue for me, of course, was hunting, horses, and the geography that both of us, that Roosevelt during a certain period of his life knew and that I knew. Then the organization took care of itself. As far as the things that it reveals about oneself, I guess a belief in those old Greek things about the universal themes, birth, life, death, and in a sense, when you interact with the environment as a hunter, or for that matter as a non-hunter, those things are always before you. So yes, there was a chronological side in the sense that I start early with Roosevelt as a young 25-year-old coming to the Badlands, and I end with his death. It certainly always ties back to those universal themes.
Well, I guess I was just going to say that I think that I learned I've always been a frustrated doctor. Yeah, so that was one of the things that I learned.
Another question? Yes.
You have a story to tell, but you need to put it in a place and time. Where's the line between actual fact and fabrication when you do that?
Well, for me, there is no fabrication. I mean, there can't be. And that's probably because I come out of a reporting background. And so I would never invent dialogue that I didn't read somewhere. Anything between quotes, to me, is suspect if it's fabricated, or if the author isn't telling you, well, I'm reconstructing dialogue, and you'll see that sometimes, and authors know at the beginning of the book or something like that. But I think it's a slippery slope and a dangerous one if there's any fabrication in a book that's labeled nonfiction. So I guess I'm a hardliner on that.
maybe cut through the fact-fiction divide by maybe introducing the idea of interpretation. Because I think that we're always interpreting our materials. I was trained as a literary critic and literary historian, so perhaps I feel more comfortable with that as a necessity. And I don't have a problem with that. I think all four of us probably would agree that we were engaged in acts of interpretation. That's different from fabrication and invention. I would say that some of what I was trying to do, though, was maybe create atmospheres. So using language to create a kind of atmosphere that could recapture a moment and a place. And when people who have been there tell you that you did that well, it's a great thing to feel that, okay, at least Arlene Maloney, who's 92 and was there, told me she thinks I got the atmosphere, the mood right. Okay.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. There's something between factual reporting and fabrication, and it is, as you say, it is interpretation. As long as your reader knows you're speculating, as long as your reader knows you're not claiming something to be factual, but you feel you know your subject well enough to at least discuss what he may have thought. But with a figure like Roosevelt, this really. And again, as you say, a slippery slope, because people are constantly trying to inject him into today's political issues, for instance. And Edmund Morris handled that very well on one of the Sunday morning talk shows with, I think it was Bob Schieffer. The first time he was gentle, the second time he wasn't gentle. When he was asked what would Roosevelt think of this particular issue, the first time he said, "You can't do that." The second time he said, "That's a shit question." Bob Schieffer then got the idea that it's insane to take someone from 100 years ago and try to. So I avoided that. But on the more, I guess you'd say, emotional side, once I felt I was getting to know him, I wasn't afraid to speculate on what he might have, how he might have handled a particular thing. But always with the reader knowing what I was doing.
This will be very quick. I throw in with Bill that I think nonfiction has to be as accurate as humanly possible, and you have to stand up for it. But I had the advantage of writing about a guy who's alive. So all I had to do was call him up and ask him, or run down to Cody and say, "Is this the way it really was?" And he gave me all the time I wanted. It's hard to write about someone who's living life faster than you can write it. So that's another reason it took 6 years. But in this case, I had the diaries, which were put down as things occurred. Sometimes memoirs lose accuracy because a year later or 5 years later, somebody's memory may fail just a little bit, or you might slant something a little bit because it makes you feel better. When you have somebody who's put it down on a daily basis the way it happens, including the tone and the atmosphere and the overriding factors of a discussion in the Oval Office, you put it down that accurately, you've got a pretty clear picture of what it is. Then you feel confident, your conscience is clear, and if it's not clear, you ask the guy who you're writing about, who I had fact-checked the book to make sure that in fact and in tone and inference, it was correct. And surprisingly, even though I'd quoted things out of the diary where he referred to in his diary, they had a big fight on the floor with Robert Byrd, and he referred to him as Captain Queeg. He didn't say a word about that. He was a little upset that I had reported that he had a hernia operation in Billings. And he said, "What are the doctors in Cody going to say when they find this out?"
Final question. Anybody have one final question? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about Alan Simpson. In the days before instant replay and delayed replay, we would knock each other down and get in and hear Alan Simpson on television. And I was wondering how his wit comes through in your book. Is it easy to translate? Does it appear in the diaries? How did you handle that?
That's a good question about how to interpret the wit, because in his case, how a story is told is very important. And a lot of times I found that the actual text of jokes he told fell flat because you didn't get the facial expression, the inference, and all that. But it was a challenge to make sure that you put, when he said something that was humorous or had a twist to it, put it in the context as well as possible that you might have had hearing him say it. And I'll give you an example of one joke, only one. Ted Kennedy and Al Simpson were great friends. I mean, right until the time that Ted Kennedy died, they were speaking as often as they could. And Kennedy used to tell the story just as well as Simpson, but it's about a town meeting in Wyoming. Lots of people gathered around like this, asking questions about policy issues, and Ted Kennedy walks in. And everybody looks at him, and they know that's unusual, and he wasn't that popular in Wyoming. So he walks in, and Simpson starts to introduce him, and some guy in the back says, "Hey, that's Ted Kennedy. What's he doing here in Wyoming? That guy is a horse's ass." Simpson gets up, runs back, grabs the protester, throws him right through the door into the street. Comes back in, and Kennedy says, "My, that was marvelous. I like what you did there, Al. I didn't know this was Kennedy country." Simpson looks at him and says, "It's not. It's horse country."